Right now, you can pull out your phone, type any address on Earth, and a blue line will appear telling you exactly where to go. You've done it hundreds of times. You barely notice doing it anymore. You trust it more than your own memory, more than your own sense of direction, more than the instincts your body spent hundreds of thousands of years developing. You follow the line. You arrive. And then you forget the route almost immediately, because you never really learned it in the first place. But for 99% of human history, there was no blue line. There was no phone. There was no address. There was only the landscape, your own body, and a brain that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to keep you alive inside it. Every path you walked, you remembered. Every landmark you passed, you filed away. Every shift in wind, every change in the angle of light, every sound that meant water was nearby, all of it was data, and your brain was the only device that could hold it. Getting lost, the way you and I get lost, may be one of the most uniquely modern experiences a human being can have. In the next few minutes, you're going to find out 3 things that will probably change how you think about where you are right now. First, what archaeological evidence from 130,000 years ago tells us about how ancient humans moved through the world, and why getting lost may have been functionally impossible for them in ways we've never fully understood. Second, what the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies on Earth reveal when scientists track their movements with GPS, and what that data says about what we've quietly surrendered. And third, what is actively happening to your brain right now, today, because of a habit most of us have without even thinking about it. In 2008 and 2009, archaeologist Thomas Strasser of Providence College and his colleague Curtis Runnels of Boston University were excavating near the coastal village of Plakias, on the southern edge of Crete. What they found was startling. Hundreds of stone tools, picks, cleavers, bifaces, scrapers, ancient human technology, embedded in geological layers that place them between 130,000 and 190,000 years old. Not dozens, hundreds, scattered across a site that had clearly been visited repeatedly, deliberately, over a long span of time. The problem, and the revelation, is that Crete has been a fully isolated island for more than 5 million years. There was no land bridge. There was no way to walk there. The sea has surrounded it for longer than our entire genus has existed. And yet here were the tools. The tools could only have arrived by watercraft, which means that whoever made them, whether modern humans or their archaic relatives, crossed open Mediterranean water on purpose and reached a destination they'd somehow charted, planned for, and navigated toward. This wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't a single desperate crossing. The sheer number of tools makes a one-off stranding implausible, as Strasser himself noted. These were travelers who returned, who knew the route, who carried a map of the sea inside their heads and followed it across water that offered no landmarks, no trails, nothing but the stars above and the current beneath them. Getting lost, for them, was not the default. Orientation was. And Crete is not the only evidence. In the Western Pacific, researchers from the University of Tokyo analyzed what it would have taken for Paleolithic people to cross the Kuroshio Current, one of the strongest ocean currents on Earth, to reach the Ryukyu Islands of Japan some 30,000 years ago. The islands were invisible from shore. The current actively pushes boats off course. Using ocean simulations and experimental archaeology, the team showed that the crossing required not just courage but precise navigational strategy, launching from the correct point on the northern Taiwanese coast, paddling at a calculated angle to compensate for the current's pull. These were not people wandering and getting lucky. These were people who understood their environment with a depth that we have largely stopped trying to match. Here is the data point I want you to remember. In 2021, Brian Woodavakula published a study in Nature Human Behavior built from GPS devices worn by the Hadza people of northern Tanzania, one of the last communities on Earth living by hunting and gathering, in ways that closely resemble what our ancestors did for most of human prehistory. The researchers tracked 2,078 days of individual movement, the largest GPS dataset ever collected on any traditional subsistence society. And what they found was this: Hadza men covered enormous daily distances along sinuous, exploratory paths through open savanna and woodland. Territories measured not in city blocks but in square kilometers of landscape they carried entirely in their minds. They didn't retrace the same routes mechanically. They ranged. They explored. They moved through the land with a fluency that suggests not just familiarity but something closer to intimacy, the way you know the rooms of a house you've lived in for decades, in the dark, without thinking. No map. No app. No second guessing. For the vast majority of human history, your brain didn't ask for directions. It was the directions. But here's what nobody talks about. All of that navigational intelligence, that extraordinary, hard-won spatial awareness that let ancient humans cross invisible stretches of ocean and track prey across unmarked savanna, it didn't just disappear when we invented GPS. It's still in your brain right now, in a structure called the hippocampus, waiting. And we are, quietly and methodically, letting it die. Your brain was not designed to outsource navigation the way you do it right now. For most of human existence, building a mental map of your environment wasn't a hobby. It wasn't optional. It was the difference between finding water before nightfall and not finding it, between knowing the path home and vanishing into the dark. The hippocampus, the seahorse-shaped structure deep in your temporal lobe, evolved, in large part, to do exactly this work. It builds cognitive maps. It anchors you in space. It holds the landscape inside your head so your body can move through it without assistance. When you walk a new route and try to remember it, that's the hippocampus working. When you feel a vague pull toward home, even in unfamiliar territory, that instinctive tug that something is north or west, that's the hippocampus working. It is one of the oldest, deepest, most essential structures in the human brain. And it is exquisitely sensitive to whether or not you actually use it. The evidence that this system is still built for active use is overwhelming. Studies of London taxi drivers, people who spent years memorizing the entire street grid of one of the world's most complex cities before being licensed to operate, showed measurably larger hippocampi compared to non-drivers. The brain physically grew to accommodate the navigational demand placed on it. More grey matter. More processing power dedicated to building and holding spatial maps. The hippocampus responded to use the way a muscle responds to training. It expanded. It became more capable. And when those same drivers retired, over time, the advantage began to fade. Back among the Hadza, Wood's research showed that this kind of spatially complex, exploratory movement, covering ground, reading terrain, updating your mental map in real time, is not just culturally transmitted. It's what a human body in its ecological context naturally does. It is the baseline. We are the anomaly. And in 2020, researchers Laure Darmany and Veronique Bobot published a study in Scientific Reports that tracked people's GPS use over time and tested their spatial memory. The finding was direct. The more someone relied on GPS since the initial round of testing, the steeper their decline in hippocampal-dependent spatial memory. Not because GPS is inherently dangerous. Not because the technology is malicious. But because the hippocampus operates on a principle that is ancient and unforgiving: use it or lose it. When the brain no longer needs to build maps, it stops building them. When the demand disappears, the capacity quietly follows. You were not designed to be guided. You were designed to guide yourself. The first commercially available GPS navigation systems for consumers arrived in the mid-1990s. Within 2 decades, the technology was in everyone's pocket. Within 3, it had become so automatic that most people under 30 have never taken a long drive in an unfamiliar city without it. Never printed directions. Never read a paper map with any real intention of following it. Never had the experience of being somewhere strange, phone dead, and having to reconstruct the path home from memory and instinct and the angle of the setting sun. But the real shift wasn't technological. It was conceptual. We stopped thinking of navigation as something a body does and began thinking of it as a service a device provides. That's a very different relationship with space. And it happened extraordinarily fast, in evolutionary terms, in the blink of an eye. Here is the thing about that shift that most people don't know. The English word lost descends from Old English Lucian, and Lucian didn't mean unable to find your way. It meant to perish. To be destroyed. The Proto-Indo-European root behind it, lu, meant to loosen, divide, cut apart. Dissolution. Destruction. The severing of something that was whole. For the people who built this language, who lived in small groups across vast and unforgiving landscapes, for whom a wrong turn could mean death by exposure, starvation, or predator before morning, spatial disorientation and death were not 2 different problems. They were the same problem, described with the same word. To be without place was to be without survival. There is something almost unbearable about that when you sit with it. The word we now use casually, "I got a little lost on the way over," was once a word for annihilation. The concept of being casually, temporarily, merely inconveniently lost, the kind of lost you fix by checking your phone, that concept didn't exist. Not because ancient humans were better at reading maps, but because the map was them. It was their body, their memory, their accumulated knowledge of the terrain. You cannot be lost when you are the map. You can only be lost when you have forgotten that you ever were one. We didn't just lose the skill. We lost the stakes. And then we lost the word for what the stakes even were. Canadian anthropologist Ariane Burke has spent years studying how navigation shaped the Paleolithic mind. What she found cuts against the image of ancient humans as isolated, frightened creatures stumbling through a dangerous world. They maintained social networks, she argues, across tens or hundreds of square miles of wilderness. They visited neighboring groups. They shared information about landscapes they'd never personally seen. To do that, you needed more than courage. You needed a dynamic cognitive map that you constantly updated, absorbing reports from others, integrating new terrain, holding a model of the world in your mind that was accurate enough to travel across it with confidence. Navigation, in other words, wasn't just a survival skill. It was the architecture of human connection. The social world was built on the spatial one. Think about what that means. When an ancient human memorized a route, they weren't just learning a path. They were maintaining a relationship with a place, with the people who lived there, with the landscape that connected them. Every remembered landmark was a thread in a web of belonging. The Inuit navigated by wind patterns they had named. Aboriginal Australians followed songlines, routes across the continent encoded in music, landscape, and story woven together so completely that to sing the song was to walk the road. For them, geography and memory were not separate things. The land remembered you because you remembered it. Ancient humans navigated toward islands they couldn't see from shore. They crossed open ocean in the dark. They carried entire landscapes inside their bodies, updated those maps in real time, and moved through the world with a spatial confidence that we, their direct descendants, have traded away in roughly 30 years. We traded it for convenience, for efficiency, for the low hum of a voice telling us to turn right in 300 meters. And the brain we were born with, the same brain shaped over hundreds of thousands of years to build those cognitive maps, to feel the pull of familiar ground, to know, without looking, which direction home is, that brain is still there. Still waiting to be used. Still capable, given the chance, of doing everything it was designed to do. But every year, its waiting gets a little quieter. There's a phrase researchers now use, almost gently, when they describe what happens to the hippocampus when we stop navigating on our own. They say it gets smaller. More precisely, it loses grey matter. The landscape inside us, the one that was always supposed to mirror the landscape outside, begins to dissolve. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just slowly, imperceptibly, the way a path through tall grass disappears when no one walks it anymore. The way a language dies when the last person who speaks it fluently stops speaking it. The way a skill that took 200,000 years to build can quietly unravel in a single generation, without anyone deciding it should. We didn't get lost. We just stopped knowing what it felt like to be found. When was the last time you were somewhere unfamiliar, with no signal, and you had to find your own way home?